Israel and the United States, on the grounds of possible future threats, resorted to the use of force against Iran in serious violation of international law and Iran's sovereignty. What's more, striking Iranian nuclear facilities that are placed under the IAEA safeguards sets a bad precedent, which threatens the international non-proliferation regime, which China once again unequivocally condemns. The aforementioned acts have also undermined diplomatic efforts to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue and created a high degree of uncertainty to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2231. China is gravely concerned and deeply worried about this. President, China has noted that some members of this council have done nothing but accuse Iran of violating its non-proliferation obligations in an attempt to justify the military actions of Israel and the United States. Here, China wishes to remind these countries of the following basic facts. It is none other than the United States that started the Iranian nuclear crisis. The United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018. Thereafter, it reinstated and escalated unilateral sanctions against Iran and adopted measures of maximum pressure which prevented Iran from enjoying the economic dividends conferred by the agreement and forced the country to reduce fulfilling its obligations under the agreement. It is again the United States, throwing to the wind its own credibility, launched military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, undermining the negotiation process initiated by itself, leading the Iranian nuclear issue to yet another impasse and resulting in an abrupt escalation of the regional situation. Iran's sincerity in resolving the nuclear crisis should be valued. Up till today, Iran continues to fulfill its nuclear non-proliferation obligations and implement the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. Iran has repeatedly stated that it does not seek to develop nuclear weapons. It conducted several rounds of professional and pragmatic negotiations with the United States in a constructed manner and never abandoned its diplomatic efforts. However, some countries, citing the report of the Director General of IAEA in a one-sided manner and ignoring the positive aspects of Iran's cooperation with the agency, pushed for the adoption of a resolution by the IAEA Board of Governors without adequate consultations, thus jeopardizing the atmosphere of dialogue while intensifying tension and confrontation. We call on these countries to reflect long and hard on the adverse consequences of their irresponsible move. President, China is of the view that we have yet to exhaust all diplomatic means to resolve the Iranian nuclear issue, and there is still hope for a peaceful solution. It is necessary for all parties to draw lessons from this, restart dialogue on an equal footing, and promote the return of the Iranian nuclear issue to the track of a political settlement. I wish to stress 3 points. First, the priority is to stop the fighting. Facts have shown that force is not an option for resolving international disputes, and there's no way that it can resolve the Iranian nuclear issue now. China has taken note of the current developments on the ground and looks forward to the realization of a genuine ceasefire that can effectively hold. The parties concerned should take practical measures to prevent the situation from escalating again. Meanwhile, the international community must make efforts to cool down the situation and promote dialogue and negotiation. Second, we must recognize that a political solution is the only way forward. The core aim and objectives set out in the JCPOA and Resolution 2231 remain valid in the next step of the political settlement of this issue. We must adhere to the general direction of a political and diplomatic solution and oppose the use of force and illegal sanctions. In order to balance the objectives of nuclear non-proliferation and peaceful uses of nuclear energy, Iran must continue to abide by its commitment not to develop nuclear weapons, and parties should fully respect Iran's right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy as a state party to the NPT treaty. All parties should insist on addressing the legitimate concerns through dialogue and consultation on an equal footing. Third, to start a dialogue and negotiation is the fundamental way forward. China supports all efforts to relaunch the Iranian nuclear negotiations and believes that this is also the position of the vast majority of Council members. The Security Council should play a constructive role in assisting parties in building trust, bridging differences, and creating conditions conducive to the resumption of negotiations. Relevant countries should abandon the practice of threatening to activate snapback mechanism at every turn, as this will only aggravate tensions and confrontations and even further jeopardize diplomatic efforts. A proper solution of the Iranian nuclear issue has a direct bearing on the authority and effectiveness of the international non-proliferation regime and is crucial to peace and stability in the Middle East. At present, the situation in the region is at a critical and crucial juncture. China calls on all parties to act with a higher sense of urgency and responsibility to de-escalate the situation as soon as possible and resume negotiations at the earliest possible date. As a permanent member of the Security Council and a party to the JCPOA, China will continue to maintain an objective and impartial position, strengthen communication and coordination with all parties to build synergy, and uphold fairness and justice with a view to playing a constructive role in restoring peace in the Middle East and promoting a political solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. Thank you, President.
Madam President, in the night of June 12th to 13th, member states of the parties to the NPT carried out unprovoked aggression, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear disaster. The Russian Federation strongly condemns the attacks on Iran, including its peaceful nuclear infrastructure, which is subject to IAEA safeguards. The actions of the U.S. and Israel directly violated the UN Charter, Security Council resolutions, including 487 and 2231, which we are discussing today, as well as the Charter of the IAEA and relevant resolutions of the IAEA General Conference. They constitute a direct and very dangerous challenge to the authority of the NPT, especially Iran's right guaranteed under Article 4 of the treaty to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, including uranium enrichment. And this was a major blow to the nonproliferation regime. And all of these actions were carried out by two states, one of which is a depositary of the NPT, while the other, for decades, has refused to accede to this crucial element of international security and has refused to subject its nuclear activities to IAEA safeguards. By the way, we are a bit surprised at Israel's request to take part in our meeting, which is taking place under the agenda item non-proliferation. We would like to believe that this decision hints at a potential accession of this country to the NPT, which the entire world would love to see. Colleagues, attacking Iranian infrastructure, including enterprises involved in the nuclear fuel cycle, creates a real threat of radiological consequences, which could affect not only Iranians but the entire Middle East. All of this, unfortunately, again, happened not just with the tacit consent, but with the approval of the UK, France, and Germany, which continue to consider themselves full-fledged parties to the JCPOA. Their assurances of their commitment to a diplomatic solution to the Iranian nuclear program inspired little confidence before, but currently they're absolutely impossible to take seriously. Judge for yourselves that first these countries deliberately refuse to uphold their obligations under the nuclear deal by not providing the necessary conditions for ensuring economic benefits from the lifting of European sanctions against Iran, which were in effect till 2015. And then they followed in the footsteps of the U.S., which withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, and renewed their unilateral sanctions pressure on Tehran, thus precluding any prospect of a full restoration of the JCPOA, toward which our Iranian colleagues have repeatedly expressed their openness. At the same time, Berlin, London, and Paris attempted to portray Iran's legitimate retaliatory measures, which they themselves, Berlin, London, and Paris, provoked, as unleashing some imaginary Iranian nuclear threat. They repeatedly attempted to undermine the cooperation between Iran and the IAEA Secretariat, which included efforts to settle unresolved questions. And even in spite of that, Iran remained and remains the most rigorously verified state out of all the members of the IAEA. And the Director General of the IAEA's reports clearly indicate the lack of any proliferation risk. Here I emphasize that the IAEA's reports in nowhere mention the conversion of Iran's nuclear material for military purposes or for any undeclared purposes. So the IAEA has observed no signs that Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. Therefore, all of the assertions of our Western colleagues to the contrary are falsehoods calculated for an audience that has not read these reports or that do not understand this issue. The cynicism and hypocrisy of our Western colleagues reached a peak on June 12th. On that day, the IAEA Board of Governors adopted yet another puffed-up resolution on Iran, divorced from reality and inspired by Western countries. Immediately afterward, Israel carried out strikes against Iran's peaceful nuclear sites. A week later, the sovereign territory of Iran was attacked by the U.S., and this demonstrates that this 1-2 punch was agreed upon ahead of time. The UK and France, which claimed to be champions of diplomacy, rushed to defend the aggression of West Jerusalem and Washington. As a result, last Sunday, we witnessed another attempt to legitimize the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter and strikes on peaceful nuclear facilities in violation of the IAEA Charter and all norms of nuclear safety and security. And German Chancellor Friedrich Merz even made so bold as to cynically remark, as he already mentioned, that Israel is doing the Europeans' dirty work. And these are the actual words of a head of government of a state party to the JCPOA. We must not forget that West Jerusalem began its operation 2 days before a scheduled round of Iran-U.S. talks on the nuclear issue, mediated by Oman, with the clear intention of sabotaging this process. Against this backdrop, the Western trio even had the audacity to call not for Israel and the U.S., but for Tehran, the victim of aggression, to return to the negotiating table. If our British, French, and German colleagues continue to threaten launching this Resolution 2231 that is a mechanism of sanctions by the Security Council on Iran, I'd like to remind them that there's no political, legal, or procedural basis for this. Berlin, London, and Paris have chronically violated this resolution and the JCPOA, and therefore do not have the right to engage this mechanism. And the U.S. no longer has any basis to do so since it withdrew from the agreement. The Vienna mechanism for dispute settlement still has not been engaged. The U.S., the U.K., France, and Germany do not have the moral right to mention this. It is their actions that truly have betrayed diplomacy and have led to the current situation. Madam President, special responsibility in this regard lies with the IAEA and Secretariat, given the infringement by Israel and the U.S. on the global nuclear non-proliferation regime, which forms the basis for the NPT. The Director General and his colleagues are obligated to uphold their mandate, as well as resolutions of the General Conference 444 and 533. The IAEA leadership must not content itself with evasive language and fragmented information, but rather provide detailed reports on the attacks against Iranian nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards. At the same time, it's extremely important to call things by their names and directly indicate who exactly carried out targeted attacks in violation of the charters of the UN and IAEA and resolutions of the Security Council and General Conference of the IAEA. Unfortunately, we've already seen that the Director General of the IAEA includes sometimes subjective judgments alongside facts and statistics in his reports, and these are then used by a certain number of countries to justify their unprovoked aggression. Madam President, the Iranian nuclear program can only be resolved through diplomacy, through negotiated solutions, which are based on international law and the principle of equal and indivisible security. The Russian Federation consistently has supported a peaceful solution to the concerns surrounding the Iranian nuclear program, which is acceptable to all parties as well as the international community as a whole. Here, the greatest responsibility lies on the UN Security Council, which is obligated to take the requisite measures. This is the goal of the draft resolution proposed by Russia together with our Chinese and Pakistani partners. Today, we are proposing to our Council colleagues an updated text that takes into account the latest developments and aims to bring about a lasting ceasefire, as well as oversight of that ceasefire by the Security Council through Secretary General reporting. The JCPOA and Resolution 2231, adopted in 2015, demonstrated that the international community at that time rejected the military approach and clearly chose diplomacy.
As tensions between Iran and Israel reach unprecedented levels, the world watches with growing alarm. What began as a regional confrontation now threatens to ignite a broader conflict with devastating consequences, not only for the Middle East, but for global stability. The latest Israeli strikes on Iranian soil have raised fears of nuclear escalation, while diplomatic efforts hang by a thread. With accusations flying and trust eroding, the question remains: will cooler heads prevail, or are we standing on the edge of a war the world cannot afford? The next moves on this dangerous chessboard could determine the fate of millions.